Chosen one. You were never just unpredictable. You were unreadable. Because you never played a game you didn't design yourself. Let's begin right here. Have you ever noticed how they freeze when they look at you? How their words start tripping over themselves? How their energy shifts from dominance to confusion the moment you don't respond the way they expect? That's not coincidence. That's what happens when a manipulator meets a system they can't override. That's what happens when they meet you. Chosen one. They thought you were just another player, another personality to decode, another soul to press, to push, to pull like a lever. But when they sat across from you, they didn't find a pattern. They found a mirror, and worse, a mirror that didn't reflect back what they wanted to see. You didn't react. You observed. You didn't flinch. You focused. You didn't shout. You shifted, and that's when it hit them. You weren't the opponent. You were the entire board. Came with strategies, but none of their tricks worked. Like a chess player suddenly realizing the pieces don't move the way they used to. The queen's gone, the king's cornered. And the board they're staring at no longer follows the rules. They relied on to win. They blinked. They stalled. Because chosen one. You're not confusion. You're clarity. And clarity, to the manipulator, is chaos. You didn't just throw off the rhythm. You dismantled the music. You see, most people, they loop. They repeat patterns. They respond like clockwork. That's what manipulators depend on. The same reaction, the same emotional bait, the same predictable spiral. But when you stepped out of that cycle and stood in silence, they felt it, that deep, unsettling power. That realization that nothing they do moves you anymore. And that silence? It wasn't weakness. It was command. It said, I don't need to fight you. I already won. It said, this isn't your game. It's mine. It said, you don't get to read me. I'm the original code. Chosen one, listen when they can't predict you. They start projecting. When they can't lead you. They start labeling you. Too much, too cold, too sensitive, too strong. But let's tell the truth here. They weren't confused by your intensity. They were intimidated by your stillness. Because you didn't show your hand. You were the hand. You didn't walk in with noise. Became the silence that made the room listen. You didn't attack. You revealed. You didn't run. You reflected. They were ready for an argument. You gave them stillness. They expected chaos. You gave them presence. And now, long after the last word, they're still watching, still searching, still wondering, because what they couldn't control, they can't forget, and what they couldn't break, they now worship in silence. So let them watch. Let them replay your calm. Let them study your silence. Like it's sacred scripture, because it was, were never meant to be figured out. You were meant to be felt. You were meant to be honored. And chosen. One, if you've ever felt their confusion grow when you said nothing. If you've ever seen their confidence collapse under your clarity. Drop this in the comments. I'm not predictable. I'm the original code. Because that's what you are. Not a reaction. A revelation. Not a glitch. A divine algorithm. And if this message is waking something up in you, if you feel the shift, hit the like button. Subscribe and fuel this mission. You're not watching this by accident. You're watching this because you're the one they couldn't crack. And now, you're ready to walk with that truth like a weapon. Let's go deeper. This is just the beginning. Chosen one. Have you ever gone quiet and they mistook it for weakness? They thought you froze, but really, you saw the whole map. They didn't know. You were never reacting. You were reading. Every pause. Every smirk. Every half-truth. Wrapped in a compliment. You saw it. And instead of confronting it head on, you did something more dangerous. You waited. You watched like a strategist, not a victim. You didn't flinch. You filtered. You didn't lash out. You listened. They believed they were the hunter dot setting traps, spinning emotional webs, crafting moments they thought would break you. But while they were busy building the bait, you were sketching the entire battlefield. They didn't realize the prey they were circling wasn't afraid dot, it was recording dot, recording every shift in tone, every contradiction, every time their words didn't match their energy dot. And you stayed still, not because you didn't feel, but because you chose not to leak power. You didn't react. You analyzed dot, and that's what they couldn't handle. Because control doesn't come from chaos dot, it comes from clarity dot, and your clarity, it's what made their games collapse. You didn't question yourself. You questioned the system, and what you found was a pattern made of fear, ego, and manipulation. A pattern you refused to step into. C. They expected a storm. You gave them sky. They expected fire. You gave them silence. They expected confusion. You gave them vision. They thought you were caught in their trap, but they never asked, what if the trap was being observed the whole time? And that's what scares them now. You didn't fall for the bait. You followed the trail dot. You saw the exit door long before they blocked the hallway. Chosen one, you weren't running. You were remembering. You weren't lost. You were locating the blueprint. They wanted urgency dot. You gave them strategy dot. They needed your emotion to feel powerful. But you were too busy mapping the soul behind the mask. And now they're wondering how you slipped through, how their old tactics failed, why none of it worked. But you know why. Because you weren't in their emotional war. You were in your spiritual. Study dot. So if you've ever gone quiet, not because you were afraid, but because you were already 10 moves ahead, comment below. I don't react. I'm reading the soul map. Let them guess. Let them wonder, because silence in the hands of the aware is sharper than any scream from the triggered. You didn't lose the game. You drew the map dot, and that, chosen one, is why they'll never forget the way you sat still as their entire strategy unraveled in your silence. And now, let's move to the next truth, because there's more they never saw coming. Chosen one, let's say this clearly. You didn't go silent because you were scared. You went silent because you were in command. And that's the part they'll never admit. They thought your silence meant confusion. But in truth, it was the most dangerous kind of answer. Not fear, not weakness dot, but power dot. Real power doesn't shout, that it doesn't argue for proof. It doesn't explain itself to chaos hoping. To be crowned king dot, it simply stands like a mountain unmoved by wind. Chosen one, you felt it, didn't you? That subtle shift, when you realized your voice was sacred, and not everyone deserved access to it. That moment when your silence became the loudest force in the room. You see, manipulators survive off of response. They prod, they provoke, they create messes, then beg you to explain them. They say things not to speak truth, but to trap you in defending yourself against lies dot, and every time you refuse to engage, they lose access to your energy. That's not passivity. That's possession of divine self-control. You weren't quiet because you didn't know what to say. You were quiet because no reply was worthy of the truth you carry. They wanted noise. Gave them silence. They wanted a fight. You gave them a void dot, and that void, it swallowed them whole. Because nothing haunts a manipulator like a soul they couldn't provoke dot, like a target that didn't bite, like a being that chose stillness, not out of fear, but out of knowing. You didn't withdraw. You ruled dot with silence as your sword, with stillness as your shield, with composure as your crown. Let's talk image for a second. Imagine a massive iceberg, not loud, not moving, not aggressive dot, just still. Yet its presence bends the flow of the ocean dot, its weight shifts entire currents. That's you. Chosen one, you don't have to yell. You don't have to explain, Dot. You simply exist with such energetic density. Every room you enter begins to shift, and they feel it, Dot. Oh, they feel it, Dot. They feel your refusal to be baited, Dot. They feel your detachment. From their control, they feel your gaze calm, unshaken as they flail in a drama they hoped would pull you in. But you didn't show up for the drama. You came with a Kona blueprint. You didn't clap back. You held your ground. And while they threw emotional daggers, hoping for blood, all they got was the cold steel of your silence. That silence? It was a decree, Dot. It sighed. I do not explain myself to distortion. I do not engage with confusion. I do not lower my frequency to be heard. It said, this is not your kingdom. You don't get to rule here. So chosen one, hear me. You didn't disappear. You declared. You didn't run. You rose above, Dot, because true authority doesn't fight for the final word, Dot. It knows the weight of presence. Alone, you didn't speak because you didn't need to. Your alignment already said enough. Now they're spiraling, not because you hurt them, but because you wouldn't dance to their noise. They replay every moment, trying to make sense of how you slipped through their grip. Trying to reverse engineer a silent Sithi couldn't interrupt, because silence like yours wasn't emptiness, Dot. It was intelligence, Dot. It was strategy, Dot. It was protection, Dot. It was reverence for your own soul. Let that sink in. The absence of noise doesn't mean absence of force, Dot, in your case. It means presence of discipline, wisdom, and high frequency. And if you've ever felt that tension rise where someone needed you to argue, to cry, to beg, and instead you met them with stillness, then you already know what this is, Dot. It's energetic sovereignty, Dot. And now, chosen one, I want you to say it out loud, not just with your mouth, but with your posture, with your choices, your protection of peace. My silence is not weakness. My silence is a command. Say it with your whole spirit, then type it below in the comments. My silence is a command, because from this point forward, you don't owe explanations to chaos. You don't perform healing for unready hearts. And you do not rent space in your spirit to people who feed on drama, Dot. You carry too much light for that, Dot, so let your stillness disturb them. Let your non-response echo in places they tried to control. Because your silence isn't empty. It is the voice of divine authority that speaks only when necessary, and when it does, it shifts entire atmospheres. Let's continue. There's more truth rising through you. This mission isn't done yet, chosen one. You didn't walk away to prove a point. You walked away to protect your soul. That wasn't an exit. It was a liberation, because you didn't leave in rage. You left in revelation. You left because something deeper whispered, this is no longer your battlefield. And that's the truth they never understood. They thought your silence meant you gave up. They thought your distance meant you lost. But really, you won the moment you stopped needing to stay. You weren't abandoning the connection. You were honoring your evolution. Let's be clear. You didn't leave as punishment. You left as graduation, because some places are not homes. They are classrooms, and some people, they're not soulmates. They're spiritual assignments. Assignments that come with lessons in clarity, boundaries, and spiritual alignment. You passed that test. Chosen one. You saw the same patterns, the cycles, the chaos, the blame games. And instead of looping again, you said, enough. That wasn't weakness. That was awakening. You were the soldier in the war of energy, fighting with love, fighting with empathy, fighting with hope that maybe, just maybe, they would see your heart and rise with you. But then the moment came, the moment your spirit whispered, this war doesn't need another battle. It needs your exit. So you stepped out, not in defeat, not in drama, but in divine clarity, because no chosen one was ever meant to bleed for a cause that refuses to see their worth. Let's sit with the image. A warrior stands still on a battlefield, weapons untouched, heart still strong, but eyes clear now, not clouded by emotion, not desperate for validation, just awake. And then, without a word, they drop the sword, turn away, and walk into the light, not because they couldn't fight, but because the war had no meaning anymore. That chosen one was you. You didn't leave to hurt them. You left to heal yourself. You didn't walk away from love. You walked away from a place where love was manipulated, conditioned, used as currency. You were not made for that. Your spirit is too deep. Your frequency too refined. Your mission too sacred. And sometimes, the greatest act of power isn't in staying strong inside the chaos, but in stepping out of it completely. You didn't run. You remembered. You remembered your value. You remembered your calling. You remembered that peace is not a reward. It's a birthright. And if you've ever had that moment where you chose to walk away, not out of revenge, but out of inner revelation, this is your confirmation. You didn't abandon them. You chose yourself, and that's not selfish. That's sacred. So comment this now. I didn't walk away. I graduated. Let the world know you didn't leave out of fear. You left because you finally knew your soul didn't belong in a cage of compromise. Let them wonder why you don't chase. Let them reflect on why you didn't fight for one more round. Because you knew it was never about winning the war. It was about walking into your freedom. You didn't close the door in bitterness. You closed it in honor. You didn't turn your back on love. You turned your face toward wholeness. And that's what makes them tremble, because you didn't disappear with fireworks. You disappeared with clarity. And clarity doesn't scream. It resonates. So here's your truth. Chosen one, you didn't leave because you were lost. You left because you were finally found. And now, you carry peace where they once planted pain. You carry silence where they once stirred storms. You carry freedom where they once fed fear. That's the kind of exit they can't forget, because it wasn't the sound of footsteps. It was the silence of sovereignty. You didn't leave behind a mess. You left behind a mirror. And what they see in that mirror now is what you saw long ago. A war that only ever existed because someone refused to grow. So walk proudly. Chosen one, you didn't abandon them. You rescued yourself. Let's move forward. There's more rising inside you now, chosen one. Let's tell the truth. They didn't lose a person. They lost a mirror. And not just any mirror, a sacred one. The kind of mirror that doesn't flatter. The kind that doesn't lie. The kind that shows what's really there, even when they're not ready to see it. Have you ever just existed? Not pushed, not provoked, and still watched someone become uncomfortable in your presence? That wasn't because you were wrong. It was because you were real. And when someone's whole identity is built on illusion, reality feels like a threat. You didn't expose them with words. You exposed them with presence. You were a walking contradiction to everything they were pretending to be. You didn't wear a mask, so their mask started slipping. You didn't play a role, so their performance began to crumble. You weren't trying to fix them, correct them, or confront them. But the fact that you stood in your truth made their lies echo louder. You became the stillness that made the noise inside them unbearable. You became the reflection they couldn't control. Imagine it like this: giant mirror placed in the center of a masquerade ball. Everyone wearing carefully designed masks, performing lines they've rehearsed for years. Then you walk in. No costume, no act, just presence. Still, calm, whole. And suddenly, the masks start to feel too tight. The script starts to sound fake. The room gets quiet, not because you said something, But because you're being disrupted the performance, that's you, chosen one. You are the energetic reset they didn't ask for, but couldn't ignore. You didn't do anything dramatic. You just stood there, real Dot, and that reality? It shattered the fantasy they lived in. They thought they were losing attention. They were losing the one person who saw them completely and didn't flinch. That's not loss. That's revelation. They weren't grieving a relationship. They were grieving the version of themselves they pretended to be around you because you didn't feed their ego. You fed their truth. You didn't mirror their image. You mirrored their essence, Dot. And when you left, they weren't left with silence. They were left with a reflection they could no longer escape. Chosen one, you weren't a threat. You were a trigger. But not because you were cruel, because you were clear. Not because you were loud, but because your energy told the truth, tried to box you in, label you, shrink you, make you digestible. But your authenticity was too vast, too pure, too unshakably whole. They couldn't handle it because to be around someone that whole means having to face all the ways. They've broken their own integrity. And that's the part they'll never say out loud. You made them feel everything. They buried. Your calm made their chaos louder. Your presence made their persona collapse. Your love made their fear undeniable, Dot. So if you've ever stood in silence and watched someone unravel, not because you did something, but because your truth simply existed, then know this. You weren't the problem. You were the mirror. Comment. Now, I am the reflection they couldn't handle. Let that be your declaration. Because you don't need to defend your clarity to those still hiding in fog, Dot. You don't need to dim your light just to make shadows feel comfortable. You were never meant to be digestible. You were meant to be disruptive, to awaken, to reflect, to reveal, Dot. And now that you're gone, they're left with the image you showed them. And no mask can unsee it, Dot. Let that echo stay. Let that silence work. Because while they search for someone easier to impress, they'll remember the one who didn't need performance to be powerful. That's your legacy, chosen one. You didn't just walk into the room. You shifted it, and you didn't break them. You simply stopped reflecting what they refused to become. Let's keep going. Your presence still has more to awaken. Chosen one, you were never just overlooked. You were underestimated until it was too late. They didn't choose you, not because you lacked value, but because they lacked vision. You weren't passed over because you were unworthy. You were passed over because they couldn't comprehend magnitude. You were not beneath them. You were beyond them, Dot. And now they feel it. The weight of what they mishandled. The absence of what they couldn't possess. The ache of recognizing that what they treated like a trial version was actually a masterpiece. Let's make this plain. You weren't ignored because you were too much. You were ignored because they were too small to hold what you carry. You weren't too intense. You were too real. You weren't too emotional. You were emotionally fluent. You weren't meant to be palatable. You were meant to be transformational, Dot. But they didn't want transformation. They wanted control. They didn't want wholeness. They wanted convenience. They didn't want depth. They wanted distraction. And because you didn't come in a familiar shape, because you didn't fit the pattern they were used to manipulating, they dismissed you. They labeled your silence as confusion, your distance as coldness, your discernment as drama, and they told themselves a lie they could live with, that you weren't ready, that you weren't for them. But the truth? They weren't ready for you. They weren't equipped to handle someone who didn't need their approval, someone who didn't beg to be chosen, someone who knew their worth, even when no one clapped, because you didn't show up trying to be picked. You showed up as the whole frequency. You walked in with a kind of sacredness that made their shallow feel exposed. You carried a kind of light that made their shadows feel threatened. You radiated a kind of peace they only knew how to pretend to have. So what did they do? They projected. They mocked. They minimized. They looked at a masterpiece and called it a draft. But now they watch from the other side of the glass. Because that unfinished version of you, it's framed now, sealed, protected, displayed in light. They didn't get to witness your full glow because they mistook your becoming as brokenness. They didn't realize you were evolving not for them, but for the mission. And now, chosen one, they finally understand what they lost. Not just a connection, but an entire kingdom they weren't prepared to receive. They didn't lose someone to love. They lost the one soul that would have reflected their truth and demanded their growth. They didn't just mishandle you. They misread the assignment. You weren't an option. You were an awakening. You weren't meant to be fixed. You were meant to be felt, revered, protected, and partnered with, not possessed. They had a chance to rise with you. Instead, they chose to cage what they couldn't comprehend. But your soul wasn't made for cages. Your heart doesn't shrink for comfort. It expands for purpose. And so you left, not with bitterness, but with a quiet understanding that some people will only realize what they had when it's sitting behind museum glass, out of reach, untouchable, guarded. Now they scroll. Now they reflect. Now they repeat the phrase that burns. How did I not see it? But you know the answer. They weren't supposed to, because people can only see you at the level of vision they've developed within themselves. And if their lens is fogged with ego, with performance, with insecurity, then even your brilliance will look blurry. But here's what makes it sting. You weren't hiding. You were open, honest, present. You gave them access they didn't honor. You offered connection they didn't value. And now they try to replace you with replicas. But it never hits the same. Because once someone has tasted, real fake becomes unbearable. Once someone has stood next to power, manipulation feels cheap. Once someone has been reflected by a divine mirror, the world feels hollow. So if you've ever been overlooked, diminished, discarded, only to rise and see them watching from the shadows, this is your confirmation. You weren't left out. You were elevated beyond reach. Comment this now. I don't need to be chosen. I am the irreplaceable blueprint. Let that be your anchor. Because you don't exist to be accepted by shallow waters. You exist to stir oceans. You don't exist to be understood by the crowd. You exist to awaken the few who are called to rise with you. And if they couldn't see it, it's not your loss. It's their ceiling. They lost a mirror. They lost a moment. They lost the rarest presence they'll likely never find again. Let them regret. Let them wonder. But don't ever shrink to fit back into a mold you were born to outgrow. You are the sacred, the sealed, the final edition. They didn't fumble a chance. They fumbled a chosen one. And now they sit with that truth, etched into the silence you left behind. A silence that doesn't echo loss, but power. Let's continue. Your evolution is far from over.